Good afternoon, dear guests. Shall we start our webinar? I think the others are still joining, and it is high time to start. Our webinar is devoted to the study of translation of Uzbek literary works, and today we are all happy to see and meet all of you virtually in our online webinar, which is entitled Translating Uzbek Literature into English. So, Pointers, Perks, and Pitfalls, conducted by Carol Ermakova, internationally renowned and prolific translator and editor. So, and first of all, I would like to just mention that this webinar has become possible thanks to our international department of Bukhara State University, and who supported the idea of English literature department staff, and so we wished to organize this kind of webinar with renowned translator and editor Miss Carol Ermakova, and we invited her a guest lecturer. And of course, without his help and without his advices, this webinar couldn't be possible. And let me introduce all of you with our Vice Rector of Bukhara State University, Dr. Abror Juraev, who organized a series of webinars during the ongoing months. With his initiative, support, and advice, so we are able to see each other virtually and establish this kind of scientific dialogue. So please, Abror Turobovic.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. Dear colleagues, I'm very happy to make this speech of today's webinar. And as Firuza Hajiva said, today is one of the events within our international webinar series of Bukhara State University. As you know, due to coronavirus, many things, almost all this kind of seminars, webinars, everything is going online. And we decided at our university, except online conferences, we decided to have this 1 month series of webinars, and for this we are inviting very prominent experts, professors, businessmen, the other people to hold this kind of webinars. And I'm very happy today because it's the second webinar for today. I'm very happy to witness this webinar of Carol Ermakova, because from last year, we were in contact with Carol Ermakova through our English linguistics and literature departments, because we were planning to invite her to our university as a very prominent freelancer and translator, because as you probably already know that she's very important for because she has translated one of the most important novels in Uzbek literature, O'tgan kunlar, Days Gone By, into English. It's her service to our nation, to our country. And also she made the translation into English, the documentary about Ulugh. You know, this kind of help or service, let's say, for the nation is very appraisable. So we are very happy to host today the webinar by Carol Ermakova. Unfortunately, due to this pandemic, she couldn't come and teach and work with us at our university, but we look forward and to organize this. So today we are having the first step, let me say, and I want to wish every kind of success to Carol and our colleagues who are joining this webinar. Good luck, Carol. Please.
Thank you. Okay, is it my turn now?
Yes, please.
Okay, I should point out that even though there's been the pandemic, this is my very first experience of a webinar and Zoom. So I'm a little bit nervous, and I hope everything will work very well. So thank you very much, first of all, to everybody at Bukhara State University for organizing this and making it possible. And of course, thank you so much for inviting me. I would really have loved to have come and worked with you this year. And I'm very much looking forward to coming and teaching translation methodology with you when things settle down and travel is possible again. First of all, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to translate some Uzbek literature. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, Carol, we can hear you
Yeah?
quite well.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Just shout if it's too fast or too quiet, all right? Just let
Okay, okay.
So first of all, a little bit about myself. I studied Russian and German language and literature in St. Andrews University in Scotland. And it was while I was a student that I first visited Uzbekistan. It was a long time ago, back in 1991, my first visit to Uzbekistan. And I was fascinated. I clearly remember the bizarre, the breathtaking buildings in Bukhara and Samarkand, the colorful clothes, the khalats, the beautiful ikat silks, and of course, the mysterious ancient feel of the whole city and the whole area. Wonderful. I next visited Uzbekistan a few years later in 1995. While I was working for the European Union program called TASIS. On that occasion, we stayed mainly in Tashkent, but we did have a trip to the mountains, which was beautiful. I'm aware, of course, that a lot has changed in Uzbekistan now. The 90s were a long time ago. And nowadays, Uzbekistan is starting to become a popular tourist destination. The BBC in Britain has run travel programs about Uzbekistan. We have books now on Central Asian cuisine. And of course, there is slowly a little bit of Uzbek literature now coming into English. I translated my first Central Asian pieces back in 2011, almost 10 years ago now, and that was before many people had even heard of Central Asian literature. The book I translated was a collection of short stories by a Kazakh author, Atarbayev, Rakhmijan Atarbayev. As far as I know, these stories have never been published yet, but they were fascinating and very well written. My next encounter with Central Asian literature was also a collection of short stories, this time by the renowned Uzbek author Erkin Azam. The stories had been translated provisionally by an Uzbek enthusiast, Azam Abidov, and together with Azam, I worked to edit and polish the translations. The collection was published, first of all, with the help of the permanent representative of Uzbekistan to UNESCO. That was in 2014, I think. And then the book was republished in England by Hertfordshire Press under the title Heirs to the Great Sinner Sheikh Sanon. Maybe you know it. And I think that this was perhaps the first literature, the first Uzbek literature to be published in the UK. And then a year or so later, I began working on Kadiri's Days Gone By in 2016. So although the book wasn't published until 2018, I actually started translating in 2016, quite a long time ago. And as you know better than I, it's a huge novel, it's a vast novel. It's beautifully written and it explores many different themes and has won the hearts of many people. So it was a great pleasure to work on that novel. I've also worked on several cultural projects sponsored by the Karimov Foundation. And this has resulted in the publication of some beautiful books, a lovely volume on ikat silk, for example, and some art books, and of course the Uzbek documentary, which was absolutely fascinating. I learned a lot from that, and I can't wait to go and see the observatory. So that's a little bit about myself. I now work from home as a freelance translator, mainly with literature. The title of my talk today is Translating Uzbek Literature into English. The pointers, pitfalls, and perks. This is what's today's presentation. First of all, we'll have a look at what it means to be a translator. Then, what literary skills does a translator need? The translator as a cultural ambassador. Who is your audience? The peculiarities of translating Uzbek literature. Some of the obvious pitfalls of translating Uzbek literature, and how to deal with them. So we'll look at things like footnotes or a glossary, italics, an introduction. And then of course, we'll get onto some specific examples from days gone by. And then I think there'll be a chance for people to ask questions, and I will do my best to answer them. So first of all, what does it mean to be a translator? In English, the word translate has come from Latin, and it literally means to carry across. So as a translator, we are carrying across a text. It could be a poem, a novel, an advert even, or a legal document, but we're carrying it from one language to another, from one culture to another. And in this case, in this sense, we're building a bridge. We're building a bridge that allows the work to travel from one language to another. And in this sense, we're going between two cultures or two worlds. And perhaps we could even say that that is the job of a shaman. A shaman carries messages from one world to another. And some people would see that as a kind of magic. People sometimes ask me, wow, how do you do it? You know, translating literature, something from one culture to another. So if we look at this idea a little bit closer, we come across the word spell. Now, the etymology of the word spell is quite interesting. It goes back to the Proto-Indo-European word, which is also spell, and that meant to say aloud or to recite. Then later, of course, the word was incorporated into the term gospel, a biblical term meaning good news. And of course, it's associated with casting a spell, making a spell, and that is magic. Say that a translator is literally spelling a text into another language. We are spelling it out into another setting, and in this sense, we're also making a kind of magic. Another metaphor for a translator, which I came across recently, and I'd like to share with you because it's quite nice. This is a text written by an English lady who translates from Italian and French, and her name is Catherine Gregor. And she said this, I'll just read it out to you. Catherine says, I also often find myself comparing translating to ballroom dancing. The author must take the lead. They are responsible for navigating both of you around the room without colliding into other couples. As a translator, you need to be able to trust the author since you are dancing backwards. Your job is to know your steps and be in tune with your partner so that you can guess their next move even before they lift their feet. If your partner is hesitant, unfocused, or is trying to show off with moves purely intended to impress the audience, you get confused and downhearted, and the process becomes nothing but a series of mechanical motions until the music ends. When, on the other hand, your partner, the author, is considerate and the writer is respectful towards the readers and true to themselves, then you, the translator, strive to do everything in your power to honor them, and crafting your translation with a sense of privilege and responsibility. You can then be true to the author, and that is when the translation process becomes a fluid, elegant dance. So, according to Catherine McGregor, the translator very much relies on the author's skill and grace. I've mostly translated works of contemporary authors, and I've been very fortunate to have a good working relationship with most of them. It's very important to be able to clarify any points of doubt with the author. Of course, if you're translating a book like Days Gone By, the author is no longer around, so we have to rely on other experts and specialists to help us. Okay, moving on now. What skills does a translator need? Well, obviously, the translator needs a good knowledge of both the source language and the target language. But there's much more to it than that. Otherwise, Google Translate could do our job for us. So let me just read for you some words written by Robert Chandler. Robert Chandler is a very well-known and award-winning translator of Russian literature. And I was fortunate to meet Robert many years ago when I was just beginning my career as a translator. And Robert helped me a lot. This is what he wrote as part of a reference for me many years ago. He says, a good literary translator needs to be endowed with a number of gifts that are not often found together. Translators need a good knowledge of the source language, and they need the ability to write well in the target language. Translators need the ability to enter into cultures and ways of thinking profoundly alien to their own. And translators also need to be conscientious researchers. I've certainly found all that to be true in my career so far. And that brings me on to a point of the literary translator as a cultural ambassador. Because we're dealing two different cultures, we're transferring ideas from one culture to another, we need to know a lot about the original culture that we're translating from. Now, in the case of Uzbek literature, it's very different from British culture. So we need what I call insider knowledge. We need to have some special knowledge of the culture we're working from. In this case, we're bringing some of Uzbekistan's rich cultural heritage from inside to the outside world. We're bringing it to the wider world. And in that case, we are indeed cultural ambassadors. Sometimes we need to have what I would call an informant. We need an insider with some inside knowledge who can help us, especially if we're dealing with historical novels or novels that are very much set in the environment. So we need to liaise with somebody. Nowadays, of course, you can get a lot of information from Google or other sources, but that never replaces a real live person who lives and works in the culture. So I would say that this is my first important pointer if you're looking to become a literary translator. You need teamwork. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help. You will need an insider who can provide information on the culture, but you may also need an outsider, somebody who knows the target language very well and can help you with that. So don't be afraid to reach out and ask for people. Translation is teamwork. You need at least one person with good insider knowledge, on one person with good outsider knowledge. It's teamwork. Okay, one other thing we need to think about is our audience. Who are we translating for? It's important to think about this early on because it will determine how you deal with potential pitfalls. So some of the things to bear in mind are, for example, do you want your novel, your translation to be on the bestseller stand for young adults in a bookstore? Well, if that's your audience, the translation should flow along smoothly, it should grip the reader, and you don't want to litter your narrative with obscure cultural references and a lot of footnotes. But perhaps you're looking at an academic market, perhaps you're dealing with a more academic text, and in that case, you'll need to look at footnotes, the introduction. They're appropriate in this case. Just to give you an example, a couple of years ago, I translated a book by an Uzbek academician. He was writing on Afghan history. And there, of course, I was dealing with facts and very precise language rather than stylistic devices or lyrical interludes. Another point to consider, which is very important, is whether you're looking at a US or a UK publisher. British English and American English are really quite different, and the British reader and the American reader may have different expectations. Again, just to give you an example, early on in my career, I was given a grant from the UK Arts Council to translate a short novel. And it was published years later by a US publisher in America. And in fact, the US publisher edited some parts so drastically that I could barely recognize some sections. And the US publisher even asked the author to rewrite the ending of the novel to make it more suitable for Americans. So whether you're dealing with the US or the UK is something to think about early on. Of course, you know, are you trying to make a political point? Are you interested in historical accuracy? About historical accuracy, we've already mentioned the documentary on Uzbek. And of course there, I had to do a lot of research and really get the facts straight to check scientific things about astrology, astronomy, and historical facts. And it was extremely interesting. So that's another pointer. When you're starting your translation, think about who your audience would be. Okay, so far we've been talking very generally. Now we can look a little bit more specifically at Uzbek literature. One of the first things that all translators working from Uzbek or Kazakh or dealing with Uzbek literature, one of the first things we all notice is the spelling. It seems perhaps a very mundane point, something very ordinary, but it is a big headache for translators into English because the Uzbek language has gone through so many scripts in the last 100 years. You have changed from Arabic to Latin to Cyrillic, back to Latin. And so there are no or very few established spellings. Even the city, would you spell it Samarkand with a K or Samarkand with a Q? Then there's famous characters like Avicenna, or would you prefer to use Ibn Sina? There are many different spellings for Navoy, and of course, even for Kadiri himself. So when we're thinking about how to spell a word in English, there are a couple of things that it's worth thinking about. One is, how will the English reader pronounce the word? And will that be more or less correct? And then, is there a spelling that's already common, already established? in which case it's best to use that. I'm actually working on another Uzbek novel at the moment. I can't tell you the title, but I'm working with 2 reference books on this translation. And one of the reference books is published in America in 2002. And the other one is published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. And they have completely different spellings of the names, the places, everything. So in some instances, we have a Q, a K, a KH, a J, as in Jigit, or Dastrahan, sometimes with an X. It's a terrible, terrible problem for translators of Uzbek literature. I would say this is the first pitfall. Ultimately, your decision would depend on your audience and also on the publisher. The publisher may already have a spelling convention, in which case it's easy and you can just follow that. Okay, so that's perhaps the first pitfall. Another thing to watch out for, of course, are cultural specific terms. Now, we find these in any literature, any culture. It's not just Uzbek literature. The difference is perhaps that many English speakers are very familiar with words from other cultures. For example, croissant from the French, or siesta from Spanish, cappuccino, chateau. These are all foreign words, but most English readers would no longer even notice them. We're completely at home with them now. That's quite different. It's a different case with Uzbek cultural terms. Most English readers would not know dastarhan, jigit, ichkani, for example. Perhaps the only term that we would really know is the idea of the dervish from Sufis. And perhaps now we would recognize plov, the famous food, Uzbek food. But other than that, we're going to need to explain them perhaps and give the reader a helping hand to understand the richness of Uzbek culture. So as a translator or a publisher, you have several options. And the first one we're going to look at is footnotes. For days gone by, footnotes was an easy choice because Kadiri himself uses footnotes in his original text. He wants the reader to understand the broader context of his work. And so I wanted the English reader to understand the broader context in the same way. I've just got a little example here on the screen for you. I think you can read it yourselves. So the first footnote here is referring to boza, the drink. Now, we give a little explanation saying it's an alcoholic beverage brewed from millet. Then just further down in the next sentence, we have the idea of a boza khana. Now, this, we've already established that boza is a drink. We know where our hero Atabek is. And so here we can just slip the translation into the text alongside. A boza khana tavern. And we're giving the reader still the original Uzbek term, so they're learning, but we're also giving them a quick translation, and they're not worried about it. It flows easily. Now, this is a good example because this is actually one of the instances when Kadiri himself gives a footnote. So I've obviously translated his footnote. He gives a little historical background. So the reader has, you know, a clear understanding of the word and also can see that it's a foreign term. And I think this enriches the translation. For me, certainly, I like footnotes because I think it's fair to assume that people who are reading a book translated from Uzbek or from Russian in Uzbek literature, a person reading about Uzbekistan would be curious to know more about the culture. And so in this case, we're doing our reader a favor when we give them a little more information. Just another point on footnotes. Perhaps you remember in the English translation, it's page 156. It's Kumush's letter. Kumush is writing to Atabek, and she signs herself as Tuprak Bibi. Now, there's a significance. Why does she sign herself like that? Before she has been Kumush, the silver one, and now she's Tuprak Bibi. So obviously we need to explain the significance of this to the reader. And in this case, I decided to give both a footnote with the translation and also slip it into the text. So if you have the book, it's page 156. This is how Kumush signs her letter. She says, "These words are penned by Tuprak Bibi, a woman trampled in the mud, a woman discarded." So in this case, I put the translation into the letter, into the text, and also put a footnote. I think it's a good idea, if you can, to put the translation side by side with the Uzbek term, with the cultural term. But of course, you can't always do that because sometimes there isn't a straight translation. For example, if you're dealing with something like the Ichkari or the Mehman Khana, you need to explain it a bit. There isn't a single word. So in that case, you would put a footnote at the bottom with a more detailed explanation. One disadvantage of footnotes is that it can make the text seem a bit heavy or perhaps academic. However, in the publication of Days Gone By, it's such a beautiful publication. They used such a lovely font that the footnotes are not at all intrusive and you hardly notice them. So the next option is to use a glossary. Now, a glossary can be useful if you want to give a more detailed explanation of the cultural term. A glossary can also be useful for people who are studying Uzbek culture, because then they have all the cultural terms together at their fingertips. I'd just like to give an example. This is not from Days Gone By. This is from the collection of stories I mentioned earlier by Erkin Ezam. These were just a few suggestions I thought would be helpful to put in the glossary. So you can see them there. A disadvantage of the glossary is that if the reader forgets the meaning of the term, they're going to have to flick forwards and backwards from where they are in the book to the glossary at the back, and that could be a bit tedious. Right, moving on now, the idea of an introduction. Some books need definitely to be set in context, historical context, political context, whatever. Again, how long your introduction is going to be would depend ultimately on the publisher, the scope of the book, and your intended audience. But most translated books will benefit from a good introduction, or at least from a translator's note. This again is an example from the collection of stories by Erkin Ezam. I didn't actually write the introduction myself, but I made some suggestions of things I thought should be mentioned and explained in an introduction. So here you can see a word on names. As you know, Uzbeks and Russians, they love to add these suffixes, the opa, ochka, khan, boy, bai, John. And these are important because they show the attitude of the speaker towards the person they're dealing with. So it shows the relationship. And in this case, we need to keep them, I think. We can't just completely delete them. Otherwise, we're deleting a level of human contact and relationship in our story. So that's introduction. Now the last option, oh no, two more options. One is italics. Do you want to italicize your text? Do you put, for example, the term dastarkhan in italics, or do you simply leave it? That again is ultimately up to the publisher to decide. Italic text is usually used in academic papers, but in literature it may jar, it may seem a little awkward. Or do you simply do nothing and leave the terms as they are without any explanation? So those are a few options. Now I'd like to move on to look at some specific examples from days gone by. And I'm going to look first of all at the interlude with Kavak, the holy fool, and his belt. So I'm sure you remember this short story, if you like, within the novel. It's full of humor, it's full of local color, it has political satire, it has all kinds of traditional cultural references. And at first glance, it may seem a little bit daunting to the translator. It could seem too distant, too far away in culture. But actually, if we start looking at it, it's okay. We have a good author. Kadiri writes very clearly and very well, so we're in secure hands. Kavak, the holy fool. Western readers are familiar with the idea of a holy fool, so that doesn't pose a problem in itself. We find them in European literature, we find them in stories and tales told by the Sufi dervishes. So the term of holy fool is fine. And then of course we have the name. He is called Kavak, and Kavak in Uzbek means gourd. It's not just a name. However, if we translated it into English and called him Gourd the Holy Fool, I think it would really sound quite silly. So in this case, we leave the name and we translate the epithet. And then, of course, there's the whole idea of his gourds. There are many, many gourds. He's covered with them. He's wearing them. And in this case, I actually invented a term here, gourdlet, because we can see that Kavak is very fond of his gourd. He's telling the lineage. It becomes like a family member. And there are many ways that we could show this in English. We could call it a baby gourd, for example. But because the whole ethos of this passage is satirical and humorous, it's quite nice to invent a term and say the gourdlet. There are other ways of doing this in English. We could say the gourdkin, like a lambkin, or use ling, like a gosling, to show that it's diminutive and a baby. But I think gourdlet works very well. So here we have the passage. He recounted the lineage of the adopted gourdlet. My father was a wine gourd and my mother a mush kavak. I myself am a bell kavak. In this case, we can add a footnote with the translation. But if the reader is carried away by the story, a footnote doesn't need to detract from that. They can simply follow along the story and stick with the satire. Moving on to the idea of satire, just a little bit further on in this passage, Kavak refers to the lopsided gourd as Musulman cool the lame. So we have a lot of political satire here, but it's very clear. So if we just follow the translation quite strictly, quite literally, with a light-hearted tone, it carries it on quite well. And so by the time we've got to the mention of Karategin, we don't need to spell it out that this is a particular place or anything, because the reader has already understood that we're in a light-hearted frame of mind. There's a teasing atmosphere. And so from the context, it's clear that Karategin must be some sort of backwater, some small place. So I think this short passage is a very good section to look at to see how we can deal with a very specific cultural scene, cultural idea, even some political satire, and how we can transpose that into the English setting, the English language setting. Okay, now another passage I'd like to look at is a completely different style, and that is the very lyrical description of the night which Atabek, our hero, spends in Hodja Maoz. Atabek is in a very tormented state. His soul is full of anguish. And this section is very lyrical, very poetic. It vividly conjures up the horrors of the night, and nature is personified. We have the wind in particular seems to have a human character, a human force. This passage is also very rich in assonance and alliteration. Now that shows the importance of the sounds and which sounds we choose and what connection they have culturally. We can hear the storm whirling around, we can hear it raging, we can hear how terrifying it is. And so the whole passage, in a way, is an extended metaphor. It's reflecting our hero Atabek's tormented mental state. Now, I'd like to read this passage for you so that you can hear how it sounds in English. If you listen especially for long vowel sounds or assonance and alliteration and the rhythm. So I'll read it first in English, and then I will ask Firuza to read it in Uzbek so that we can compare the two. I've got a slide of it here so you can read along with me. Okay, so here we go. Although the moon was already full, its pale orb was hidden behind thick clouds. Night fell, a true ebony autumn night. The darkness seemed to seep from the 100-year-old grove growing profusely by the Hodja Maoz graveyard. The wind picked up, blowing from all sides now, as though wanting to whip everything away somewhere. In a murky corner of the grove, a strange figure lurked by one of the graves. Unkempt and wild, his hair dishevelled, he circled a smouldering stump, poking it with a stick, trying to coax the fire to life. The wind raged, the trees swayed this way and that, noisily shaking off their last leaves. Rooks and ravens, startled from their roosts, circled above, cawing as if protesting against the storm. The wind gained strength, howling and wailing. Unable to withstand this onslaught, the old trees in the graveyard screeched so pitifully as their branches snapped off with a crack that the eerie Sumerian darkness which shrouded everything from sight took on an even more terrifying aspect. Finally, whipped into a frenzy, the wind roared with such furious force as if seeking to crush and crumple anything which stood in its path. It toppled one of the plane trees with a mighty thud, causing the ground to tremble. It snatched the embers of the holy fool's fire and flung them into the thicket, filling the grove with sparks and lighting the graveyard up like a ghoulish picture. Then, without warning, as though its fury had been for this alone, the wind suddenly slackened, quietened. The roars and bellows of this ravenous beast gave way to mercy. The rooks and ravens, buffeted above the grove in horror for half an hour, now cawed to one another as though sharing news of the quieting storm, and swooped back to their branches. The sombre clouds covering the sky gradually dispersed and floated away as the moon, slightly lifting her her netted veil of meshed branches, gazed upon the earth. So that's how it sounds in English. I don't know if you noticed, but there's quite a lot of R sounds. There's quite a lot of G sounds. So, for example, we have ghastly growling, we have howling and wailing, the graveyard. We have a lot of these GR sounds, and they're very gruff in English. They're very dark sounds. We don't have much light or lilting sounds. And now I think, Firuza, are you ready to read for us in Uzbek?
Yes, Carol, now I'm ready.
Okay.
So now the participants, I will read this extract from the novel in Uzbek so that you could feel the difference or similarities between these two Uzbek and the English texts. Oyning 15-lari bo'lsa-da, havoning bulutligi bilan oy ko'rinmas. chin ma'nosi bilan qorong'u kuzning qorong'u bir tuni edi. Bir necha yuz yillardan beri yashab, favqulodda zo'rayib ketgan Hodja Maoz mozorining chakalagi bu qorong'ulikka bir manba kabi edi. Kuchli bir yel turgan, qandaydir bir ishga hozirlangan kabi to'rt tomonga yugurib yurar edi. Mozor chakalagining bir burchagida tutab yongan to'nka yonida sochlari o'sib, soqoliga qo'shilib ketgan bir devona bu mudhish qorong'ulikka qarshi kurashgan kabi gulxanni yondirishga tirishar. Gulxan tevaragidan aylanib, qo'lidagi kosovi bilan to'rt tomondan kavlar edi. Yel borgan sayin kuchlana bordi. Chakalak tartibsiz holga kirib ketdi. Bitta yarimta to'kilmay qolgan yaproqlar shitir-shitir to'kilishga oldilar. Qarg'a va zog'chalar ayni uyqu zamonida tinchlanganligi uchun yelga qarshi namoyish qilgandek g'a-g'u bilan chakalak ustidan aylana boshladilar. Yel kuchaygandan kuchayib borar va shu nisbatda mozor ichi ham yana bir qat qo'rqinchli holga kirar edi. Yel ketma-ket bo'kirar. Bunga chiday olmagan shox-shapadalar qars-qurs sinar. Keksa yog'ochlar g'iyq etib yonboshib tovush chiqarar edi. Yel ortiqcha bir g'azab ustida edi. Yer yuzidagi tikkaygan narsani bukib, yanchib tashlamoqchi bo'lgandek pishqirar edi. Chinorlardan birisini yerni titratib yiqitdi. Devonaning gulxanni ham to'nka-po'nkasi bilan ko'tarib, chakalakning ichiga oldi. Butun mozor ichini o't uchquni ila to'ldirib, yana ko'rinishga boshqacha bir tus berdi. Mozorni bu holatda solgandan so'ng go'yo shuning uchun g'ayratlangandek bir oz pasaya tushdi. Och qolgan sher kabi pishqirib, bo'kirishlari bosilgandek bo'ldi. Yarim soat chamasi jonsarakka uchrab uchishga majbur bo'lgan qarg'alar yelning g'azabi bosilganini bir-birlaridan bilan eski o'rinlarga qo'na boshladilar. Ko'kni o'rab olgan qora bulutlar ham tuzga bo'linib, oy ham qora parcha ichidan yarim yuzini ochib, yer yuziga mo'ralab qo'ydi. So this was Uzbek.
Okay, thank you very much, Firuza. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See there that from the Uzbek, there's also a concentration of sounds, especially at the beginning. There's a lot of repetition of the sounds, and we're carried away by the movement and the sounds that we're hearing there. And I think that this is one example where Kadiri is really very clever at personifying nature and showing us how our hero is feeling through his very, very lyrical descriptions there. Okay, now how are we doing for time? Shall I stop and open for questions, or shall we look at another example?
I think better you go on because it's very interesting.
Okay, thank you. All right, then I have another example we can look at, which is similar in that it's to do with the sounds of the text. Here, I'll just change the slide for you. It's about meaning through rhythm. Okay, this is a scene again with Atabek. He's again feeling a bit low. He's in the bar, in the tavern, and he has asked for a tune of banishment or separation. He's asked the musicians to play for him. Now, there are two melodies mentioned in this passage. One is Navo, and the other is Saft. I think that they're both very different. Obviously, the Navo is the mournful melody, and the Saft is the more cheerful one. This passage has a lot of cultural terms. We're in a place that's alien to an English-speaking reader. The instruments are different, the musicians are different, the tunes are different, the drink is different, everything is different. And yet we are dealing here with basic human emotions, a basic human situation that everybody can recognize. And so I think that here we don't need to worry too much about explaining exactly what the melody Navo is, what it means, or who wrote it. And the same with Saft. We can rely instead on the skill of the author, and we can reproduce the idea of the contrasting melodies with our language. So I'm not sure what page this is in the English book, but I can read it for you. I don't have it on the screen as a slide, but if you just listen, I'll read it slowly for you, and you can hear, particularly listen out for the long sentences, the long vowels, and the soft assonance. Okay, here we go. The minstrel, who had been strumming a simple melody, checking his dutar was well tuned, suddenly struck up Navo. At the very first notes, Atabek's whole body trembled. He swiftly emptied the bowl before him and gave himself over to the melancholy melody. The dutar spoke to him of some anguish akin to his own. It sang of his sorrow, not with its own voice, but with the voice of Atabek's own troubled soul. Memories flitted before the young man, one after another, vivid images of those recent bitter days. But no, they did not flit by. Once conjured up, they came to life, stayed with him, and did not fade. As though unable to bear these images, the dutar called them to life again, began wailing, setting the whole universe a-tremble and causing heavy hearts to ache and quiver. Unable to control himself any longer, Atabek wept, clasping his handkerchief to his eyes, but powerless to stem his tears. His will was at the mercy of the sobbing dutar, its song of sorrow. But Atabek's soul cried out for this music, this tune that ripped the accumulated pain and anguish from his heart, and he wept and wept, pouring his grief out with his tears. So here you have long vowel sounds, long sentences. You have the W, the oo sound, which is like a howl, the anguish from the soul. We have quite a few soft S sounds, the wailing, the weeping. They're long, sad sounds. But then the music changes. So I'll just read you a very short paragraph that follows directly from this. At last, when Atabek's body was quite worn out with weeping, the mournful melody Navo, which had so compelled him to keen, declaiming that man is destined for naught but misery in this world, now suddenly changed. The gleeful notes of Sabt burst into it. This abrupt change to joy brought relief to Atabek. He dried his tears. In the garden of his hopes, now washed and watered by the melody of Navo, new flowers suddenly blossomed. So this very short passage, the Saft one, it says, it's staccato sentences. We have crisp verbs, short vowels, staccato sentence. For example, abrupt change to joy. They're very short staccato. He dried his tears. Just one syllabic words here. He dried his tears. And that, for me, it shows the change in mood. We have the long, sorrowful, mournful melody of the Navo, and then an abrupt change to a more cheerful one. And this is reflected again in Atabek's own mood. He's no longer sad and sorrowful, he's more optimistic. And again, I think this is just a wonderful example of how skillful Kadiri is, because as I mentioned just before, we have a situation which could be completely alien to the English reader. You know, we've never heard of Navo, we've never heard the dutar, we've never drunk any boza, we don't know. But because the human condition, the human feelings here are common to everybody, it's very easy to actually get inside or beyond the cultural side of it and really understand and empathize with our hero. Okay, so that's what I wanted to talk about. So just to sum up, we've looked at some of the pointers. One of my first pointers would be teamwork. Consider your audience, decide a strategy and stick to it, and try to be as consistent as possible. You know, you're going to be criticized, whether you spell Kadiri with a K or a Q, with an A or an O. At some point, somebody will criticize you. But if you have, you can justify it and you're consistent, then that's fine. So that applies to the spelling, the spellings, the cultural specific terms, historical references, socio-religious references. One thing that we didn't have time to look at just now is speech and terms of address. For example, do you want your hero to say, may Allah be praised, or simply thank God? Do you want to address them in a more formal way with an Uzbek term of address such as taksir, or do they want to say my lord? These are all things that you have to decide. And then of course there's the stylistic devices that we've just looked at. And for me, one of the great perks of working with Uzbek literature is of course that there's a whole world to explore. So thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, dear Carol. So, and of course, the next part is asking questions and answering. But before starting this part, we have our guests. One of the organizers, our dean, the dean of the faculty, Malukhat Muhammadovna Jurayeva. She wants to greet you in French, and as a specialist of linguistics and as a translator of Walter's book Candide and several fairy tales from French into Uzbek, she just wants to thank you. And please, Malukhat Muhammadovna. Malukhat Muhammadovna. Malukhat Muhammadovna. So.
Not there.
Siruza? Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Bonjour, Madame Carol Ermakova. Tout d'abord, je veux remercier pour cette magnifique initiative. Étant doyen de la faculté des langues étrangères, je me contente énormément de faire un échange dans le domaine de la littérature, interprète et de la linguistique, bien sûr.
Merci beaucoup.
Je suis très contente. Si vous me permettez, je voudrais présenter un peu sur le système d'enseignement et quelques détails sur notre université.
Ok, très bien.
En Uzbekistan, le système d'enseignement des langues étrangères orienté vers la formation de la génération harmonieusement développée, c'est dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre de la loi de la République sur éducation et du programme national pour la formation des cadres. Selon le décret, le système d'enseignement supérieur des langues étrangères se développe dans notre pays, visant à perfectionner le système d'enseignement d'apprentissage des langues étrangères. L'anglais, l'allemand, le français et surtout l'allemand, l'anglais et le français.
Oui, c'est très important ça.
Très important, bien sûr. Et notre université d'État de Bukhara aussi, l'une des grandes universités de notre République d'Uzbekistan, 16 000 étudiants dans notre université, 16 000, plus de 16 000 étudiants et plus 1000 professeurs
Wow.
12 facultés, des langues étrangères. Il y en a vers 2000 étudiants.
Wow.
200 professeurs, 2000 étudiants. Et beaucoup de professeurs d'anglais, bien sûr, plus de 150 professeurs d'anglais. Et beaucoup de professeurs allemands, le français.
Très bien, c'est énorme.
Et nous avons encore des accords de coopération entre des universités françaises, allemands, Münster, des Alpes, Grenoble de la France, François Rabelais de Tours, Turin de Tours, Sorbonne 4, Sorbonne 13. Et bien sûr, en Amérique et en anglais aussi. Beaucoup des universités nous avons, merci des dieux, nous travaillons avec les collègues, avec chers collègues étrangers.
Ok, très bien, très bien.
Et voilà, voilà aujourd'hui avec vous, j'ai déjà parlé avec Firouza. Il m'a expliqué et j'ai vu de l'internet, sur l'internet, et j'ai regardé, j'ai compris comment vous travaillez. Vous êtes très bonne traductrice.
Merci.
Moi aussi, je suis interprète et j'ai traduit beaucoup d'œuvres de Voltaire, tandis à langue originale en ouzbek, bien sûr. C'est pourquoi je suis très contente de vous voir, de faire la communication, des accords avec vous. Les professeurs, les étudiants seront très contents parce que il y a beaucoup des étudiants qu'ils aiment, qu'ils préfèrent de traduire des contes, des récits, des romans, et nous travaillons ensemble avec vous sur la traduction, sur la littérature, sur la linguistique.
Très bien, très bien. Ok.
Et après,
vas-y, vas-y.
présenter une boucle, écouter avec plaisir, et je suis francophone.
Okay, merci. I will speak in English because I'm too shy to speak in French. Okay. I'm very much looking forward to coming and meeting you all when things settle down. Ouais.
Malohat Muhammedovna rahmat. Inglizchada gapiraman, fransuzchada gapirishga bir o'zgina uyalaman deb aytdilar. Buxoroga kelishni juda ham xohlayaptilar. Domla, bizlar uchun keyin tarjima qilib berasiz aytganlaringizni. Rahmat. Domla, ovozingiz uzilib kelyapti. Shu uchun savol-javob qismiga o'tsak bo'lar? So, please, dear participants, if you have... Hope. Rahmat, Domla. Rahmat. So, dear participants, if you have any questions, please, you may ask.
Firuza Melsana, thank you for organizing such a beautiful webinar. And I would like to express my gratitude to Ms. Carol. And as I joined the webinar a little bit later because of the master's defense, I wanted to know some points about the webinar subjects connected with the translation. As I teach theory and practice of translation, it is every time interesting for me to know about the pitfalls and challenges in the process of translation. So the question is connected with the pitfalls. As you understood, I want to ask, how do you cope with the challenges in the process of translation? I mean, when you come across with the culture-specific terms or the historical terms which can be called historicisms, which are not in use nowadays, but still we can see these historisms, observe these historisms in the novels as well. So how did you use, or how did you solve the problems connected with the same pitfalls? Thank you beforehand for your
There are many different ways to deal with these challenges, because it depends, as I explained earlier, it depends on the type of book you're dealing with. A book like Kadiri's Days Gone By, it's obviously full of historic references and also political references. And Kadiri himself, I think one of his aims when he was writing was to shed some light on the past. And so in this case, it's very important for the translator to bring that knowledge into the English translation. So in this case, I think it's important to use footnotes to explain. Personally, that's my preferred choice. If there is a term which is either linguistically complicated or, as you said, a historicism, then I think a footnote is a very effective way of dealing with it. If we're looking at the broader context, then you might need to use an introduction. I can give a short example of an introduction here. A couple of years ago, I translated a book. Oh, there's a strange noise. There's a strange noise. Anyway, a couple of years ago, I translated a book by Elena Chizhova, a Russian author who won the Booker Prize for one of her books. And the title of the book was Zinabas, Little Zinabas. And the whole book was so much steeped in other aspects of Russian literature that I felt we needed quite a good introduction to that. Footnotes weren't enough there. And so I put a translator's note, which was then taken up and expanded by one of my former professors at Bath University. And she actually wrote a whole paper on the specifics of the literary references there. Because even the title Zinabas is a reference to a story by Hoffmann, the German author. So in some cases you need to have a lot of background information. In some cases a footnote is good. I hope that.
May I ask? Thank you. Thank you, Carol, for your answer.
Any more questions?
Yes, please. I am Nargiza Dosbaeva from Namangan State University.
Hello.
First of all, hello. First of all, I want to express my gratitude to our guest speaker, Carol. Thank you very much. I appreciate your hard work. And I just want to share my opinion on the translation, especially the translation of the novel. So while reading the novel, I came across many Russian words translated equivalent to Chopin in Uzbek, and Uryuchina equivalent to Urik Zor Daraxtları, and Ichigi Boots equivalent to Mahse. So what do you think? Wouldn't it be better if you use it the transcripted versions of the such words right directly from Uzbek, not Russian? So why to mix two cultures, Russian and Uzbek? It's just my opinion, but I really like your translation version because there are not so much footnotes like in other translation versions. There are also two other translation versions of this novel. So I thank you so much. It's an honor for us to have your hard work. Thank you.
Okay. As I mentioned at the beginning, the spelling of terms is very problematic because sometimes the script has come from Cyrillic, sometimes it's been written in Latin. And so obviously terms could be as close as possible to the Uzbek original, But ultimately, this was a question for the publisher and the people who I liaised with. So as you know, I translated it from the Russian, but I was in contact obviously with Uzbek specialists. And for me, as I mentioned a couple of days ago to Firuza, my main aim with translating this novel, and also for the publisher, was to produce a beautiful book. The edition is lovely, you know, they've got pictures in it. They really made a beautiful presentation. And so we wanted to carry the force of the literature as much as we could. And then, of course, people will look at it from a historical point of view, a political point of view, and people will discuss it from that angle. But I think if you have the basis of a good text obviously in Uzbek and then in English, if you have the basis of a good text, then people can analyze it. And that's the job of literary critics or historians. It's not the job of the translator, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you very much for your
Okay, you're welcome.
Good afternoon, Carol Ermakova and
Hello.
others. That I'm a teacher of Bukhara State University, that's foreign, from Department of Foreign Faculty, Kenjaiva Gulro. First of all, let me send my thanks that you think that you did a great job that translating that from one culture that to another culture. It can say it's a huge work. That's why thanks a lot to you, first of all, that I appreciate this version exactly. That while reading, that while analyzing these two words, that I also come across some words, some that archaic, some culture-bound words, that in which I also get some misunderstanding. That first of all, that I would like to ask you one question: that what kind of difficulties you come across while translating such kind of words, some archaic, some culture-bound words?
Well, one of the areas which I found very difficult culturally was architecture, because obviously the novel is not even set in modern day Uzbekistan. So the architecture plays a big part in the novel. For example, we have the scene where Atabek, Hamid is trying to break into Kumush's house, and Atabek is there. We have the whole scene in the courtyard. And we have the men's quarters, the women's quarters. We have different architectural designs there. We have gates and Duval walls, many things. And this was an area that was really very difficult for me, because if you look at English architecture, it's very different. And so I had to rely as much as I could on descriptive powers. In this case, you can't find a direct equivalent in translation for these cultural terms. It's just not possible. And if we put too many, we call them loan words, if we include too many of the foreign terms, then an English reader gets tired and puts the book down. So there's one example, it's near the beginning of the book. Let me see if I can find it now. Yes, it's the part which in English, it's a chapter 5. We could do with such a son-in-law. We're entering Kutidor's house for the first time, and we're walking through the courtyard. And as I say, it was not easy for me, because it's a very different scenario from an English house. But because Kadiri is such a good writer, and he's literally walking us through the courtyard. He says, okay, you come through the gate, you go through the courtyard, there's this building on the right, there's this building on the left. So in this case, I didn't feel that I had to worry too much about the cultural terms, and I could just carry on with the description, even if it was perhaps not exact. So the outhouses and the different buildings, I think we could rely on Kadiri's clear explanation to carry us through. So that was an example.
Okay, thank you. The one thing that I mentioned was that analyzing my work, the addressing the Mirza Karim Kutudor's addressing to his wife, that in this translation that it was addressing to his daughter. It's in Kumush. While in the translation it was like mentioned that you are addressing to the Kumush, otherwise the Mirza Karim Kutub was that addressing to his wife. You see that from the Uzbek culture that we can say it's not acceptable to call exactly with the name of his spouses, but instead of this, they will try to address them with the first child's name. That, for example, if I say that you are the first child, like Carol, that parents will call like Carol's mom or Carol's dad, like this. In this part, in this episode, in this translation, I mentioned that it was maybe misunderstanding. They translated like you are addressing that Mirza Karim addressing like to his daughter, but that I think that it should be that he is addressing to his wife.
Uh-huh.
Did it? Yeah.
Okay.
That's why I'm asking that maybe that that I have another one question that have you worked like a teamwork you mentioned before that was it a teamwork like translating this book? That if there was any that from native speakers, because it is difficult to understand one culture that which is different from each other.
Yes. Of course, there were specialists who I was working with from the Karimov Foundation. The whole book was sponsored by the Karimov Foundation, and they had a lady who I worked with, an Uzbek lady, of course, and she then sent my questions on to a specialist in Uzbekistan. So there was definitely, a lot of feedback there. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Thanks
then
a lot.
the book was edited also by another English lady for the stylistics in English.
Understandable. Thanks a lot.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you.
So, do we have any questions? Please. Oh, we can't hear you, Raihona. Do you want to ask the question? Arzakulova, yeah? So, please turn on your microphone. Left corner.
It's on, but probably there is some problem with settings.
Yes, you can text.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Text.
Oh, I've just seen there are 35 messages in chat. Do I need to do anything about that? No, I can. I just see them all. Should I switch it on?
Okay, so.
She is typing her question.
Okay.
Carol, can I ask one question?
Yes.
When a translator translates something from different languages, for example, in your case, I want to ask maybe some personal questions. When you translated Days Gone By, I want to ask how much did you feel like the Uzbek culture? Do you now have something that you can tell? For example, maybe I don't know how to ask this. How much do you think now you are inside our culture now? How many percentage are Uzbek now? You.
Very good question.
Good question. Unfortunately, not enough. I've already been with you in Bukhara, no? So that was one reason why I was very much looking forward to coming, because I'm fascinated by the culture. As I said earlier, I was first there in 1991. In fact, before doing the presentation, I went and I found my old photographs from 1991. It was a completely different atmosphere. I was fascinated by it. And since then, I've done a lot of work with other cultural aspects, the Ulugh documentary film. All the details, the amazing things that he managed to do was just fascinating. And then I've been doing some work with the ikat silk. I mentioned to Feruza a few days ago that I actually think about this very often, because when I was in Tashkent for the first time, I don't remember the name of the museum, but we visited a museum and they explained one of the stories behind the ikat silk, that the inspiration came from rippling on water. And I live in the countryside, and every day I go for a walk by a stream, and there is just one part on that stream, and it looks so much like the ikat silk. You know, there's always a play of light on it. So when I'm walking past, I remember. Also, there's one author who used to work for the BBC, who I've worked with. He works in Uzbek and in Russian, and I've met him a few times. And so I have a little relationship with him there, contact with the Uzbek culture, which is I very much enjoy. But obviously I would like to feel much deeper connection with you. And that's why I'm very much looking forward to coming over. Yes.
Thank you.
So what about the process of translation? Did it just take it, did it change something in you, the translation process of the novel?
Well, yes. I mean, the descriptions in Kadiri's Days Gone By, they're so beautiful, you know, when Atabek is riding on his horse through the field full of poppies. I see it, the tulips there and all the beautiful scenery. He goes out and he drinks the mare's milk, the kumis, yes? It really makes me want to experience it much more fully. Appreciation for the history, which I knew very scantily beforehand. Different tribes coming in and out, you know, the interplay of the different peoples. Yes, definitely. It gave me a much stronger desire to come back and spend time exploring.
Okay.
Just maybe.
May I speak?
Okay.
Good afternoon, Carol. So I loved your translation very much. I bought the book too.
Okay.
I read the book. It was very interesting. And I have got a simple question. How many years did it take to translate the book?
Okay. It probably took about 2 years. Probably about 12 months to get the first draft of the translation. And then usually there's a gap from my side when it's being edited. And then the editor comes back to me with suggestions. And that's a very good gap for me, because in that space of time, it's not that I forget the book, obviously, but when you're working on a book, you become so involved in it that you can somehow get too small. You know, you're focusing on small things. And then when you have a space, you know, a few months, perhaps the editor's worked on it, then it comes back to you and you read it again freshly. You find yourself changing quite a few things. So I would say perhaps 12 months to get the initial draft. And then once it was edited, some more time.
Thank you greatly.
You're welcome.
So, Carol, there was a question from Rayhona Narzakulova, and her question is, who became the main audience of translation? I mean, the translation of the novel Days Gone By. She is writing this, and she's asking who is the main audience.
Right.
For example, we Uzbek, as I understand, maybe she's willing to know, we Uzbek people usually read our books in Uzbek language. But what about English version? Who is the audience? Now we are, of course, just analyzing, learning the language units and the stylistic devices, metaphors, all of them. But what about English version? So is it becoming famous in other countries as well?
Unfortunately, I don't think it is yet. It's very hard to get a book forward on the market, especially a translation. It depends on how it's been published, and it depends on a whole range of marketing techniques behind it. And with days gone by, with this publication, it was actually published by a French publisher. So it hasn't reached the mass UK market as yet. But hopefully it can get some good reviews. You know, it needs to catch the attention of a literary critic, somebody like that, and then they start slowly promoting it. It also depends on how it's marketed. You can, for example, try to push something through the universities as a book that people are going to study, or a more popular book. But it's very hard. It's the same with the music industry. You know, there's so much music out there. How do you choose what you're going to listen to?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's one thing that we have to work on, to actually open up and expand these translations.
And that's why, Carol, I think the researchers, the articles, scientific works are very necessary in order to promote the translation of the book. And promoting the book, we are promoting our culture, our values. That's why I think, yes, we should work on the translations of our national heritage. So please, questions? Any questions?
Satisfied.
Okay. Carol, I wanted to know about one thing. Was it difficult for you? For example, in my article, if you remember, for the first time when I just wrote you on your Facebook the letter in order to ask you whether the translation was done directly or through the mediator language, and you gave me a very polite and very open answer. And I was really at that time surprised, because mostly famous people, they do not want to share.
I'm not a famous person. I'm not famous.
No, you are not this kind of person. Yes, I witnessed. So, and while analyzing novel, I paid attention to some stylistic devices. And was it for you difficult to translate them? Because some devices can be can sound in a different way in one language, but when you are translating, for example, phraseological units or some metaphors, they can be translated differently, or if you translate it word for word, the English speaker cannot understand, the English reader cannot understand. So, and how did you deal with this problem?
When you're looking at translation methodology, there is a term that we use sometimes called compensation. So, for example, if we know that the author uses lyrical style, stylistic devices, we mentioned assonance, alliteration, or metaphors. If we know that the author is very fond of these devices, then we try to incorporate them into the translation. It won't always be possible to do it in the same way, in the same time, in exactly the same passage. I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but if we know, for example, that in a particular passage, Kadiri has used a lot of, say, L sounds, okay? In our translation of that passage, it's perhaps not possible, but we remember this and we compensate for the lack in that section by adding it perhaps to a different section. So it's like a balance, okay? It's a balancing act. We miss it in one place, but we can use it in another place. And that's why, for me, it's important to study the book a little bit first as a literary piece of work, and then we know, okay, right, so this author, he's fond of this. Other authors, they use a lot of satire or irony, and we have to remember to bring this into the English translation. So it's an awareness. We need to have this in awareness and to have it coming forward as much as we can. Metaphors, of course, they're not always going to work. I have an example from a Japanese friend of mine, an American who translates from Japanese. And she was translating one passage which in Japanese, it mentions the animal weasel. I don't know what a weasel is in Russian. It's a little bit like a fox, but a lot smaller. And in English, this animal has a very negative connotation. A weasel is somebody dishonest, somebody underhand. So, but in the Japanese, the weasel, the actual animal, has a very different connotation, a different symbology. I can't remember now, but maybe it's very clever. So if you use the same animal, you're instantly changing the whole atmosphere of the text. So what do? Do you put a different animal? Do you put a footnote saying, well, actually, yes, we use the word weasel, but it means something different? It's not easy.
Yes.
So, like I said earlier, it depends on the ethos of the whole book. It depends on the
skills of translator, just mastering the language. Yes, I witnessed that. In your translation, I could see that you are using very just authentic language, and also it is poetic language. I liked your language. So these metaphors, everything is, it makes some kind of influence on the reader.
Well, this is one thing, a question earlier, they asked me if I was liaising with a native speaker, and that was one of the things that the native speaker, the Uzbek lady who was mainly working with me, she absolutely emphasized that it was a beautiful book. It was very well written. It was very poetic in Uzbek, and we agreed at the beginning that I would use a slightly antiquated style in English. It's not, you know, if you pull a modern book off the shelf, you will find slightly different phraseology. But we agreed that I would use slightly older fashioned, you know, as if perhaps something from the idea of Jane Eyre, one of the English classics. So we agreed at the beginning that it should be as beautifully written as possible, as lyric as possible, full of stylistic devices. So that was a very good tip that she gave me at the beginning.
Carol, another very just interesting thing for me. Once I read a statement by one of the translators. I think I read it on your Facebook timeline, and it was written, you shared it. It was written, translators are like ninjas. Whenever they make mistake, they are noticed. So, yes. And the question is, so I think that it is not pleasant to hear that the critics are discussing every time your mistakes. So isn't it so? And how do you feel?
Well, it's inevitable. You know, if you sit quietly and don't do anything, you're not going to get criticized. If you put something out publicly, of course, some people will like it, some people won't. Literature is an art form, and in that case, it's a matter of taste, and that applies also to translation. I pick up translations by other people, and I look at them and I think, oh, why did they put that? You know, I would never put it like that. Because it's a matter of taste. It's a matter of taste. You know, some people go to an art gallery and they say, oh, there's too much blue in that picture or whatever. So I think with criticism, obviously you listen to it, you take it on board and you think, okay, do they have a point here? But you also have to be quite logical. You have to have decided, okay, why did I make that decision? One example, just recently I picked up a book, and it's by a very good author and a very good translator, and there was a little passage that struck me. She said, oh, he was feeling very homesick, and he went to visit a Russian lady who gave him special Russian treats, Russian biscuits. And in the English it said, she gave him gingerbread and wafer cookies. Now, I've lived in Russia. I know that they don't eat gingerbread or wafer cookies. So for me, if you remember earlier on, I had the diagram with insider knowledge and outsider. In this case, I have too much inside knowledge. I was trying to find the Russian, but for somebody from England, you know, they don't care if it's not exactly the right translation. They just knew that the man was getting some nice biscuits. So from my point of view, it was a mistake. But for the point of view of a reader who just wanted to carry on with the story, it was fine.
So that means that while translating, you are, first of all, decoding the text, understanding it, then you will encode it in your own way. And here, of course, your attitude is also put. Am I right?
Yes, yes. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's actually an Uzbek author who lives in the West now. And he talks about, what's his phrase? Adopted children. He says,
yes,
you know,
they're metaphorical.
Yes, yeah, a book is like an adopted child. So it's obviously it's the author's child, but then it's the author's words, but it's coming through you. So it's what I said earlier on. We really need to be invisible. We have to respect our authors as much as possible. I find that's a very important point, to keep the respect for the author.
Anyway, yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your answers.
You're welcome.
So please, dear guests, do you have any questions?
Can I have a question?
Yes.
Hello, Carol, and I have a question. How did you feel in the hottest parts of the novel, and what character did you see yourself in? And did you feel as if you had fallen from real life at the time?
Did I feel like any of the characters? No, I don't think I did. I don't think I actually felt like one of the characters, but of course, you can identify them in different ways. The story with Atabek's friend, the weaver, and his tragic story with his wife. This, of course, is a very heart-rending story. You can't remain indifferent to it. So I think I could identify with the emotions of different characters at different times. Luckily, I've never had many of the horrendous experiences that they had. So I think in terms of identifying with the characters, it would fluctuate from one to the other, depending on the situation. Can you repeat the first part of your question?
Okay. How did you feel in the hottest part of the novel? How did you feel yourself? Yeah, in the hottest part of the novel.
Which
the
part?
balanced parts.
Which part is the most interesting part? I think she wanted to ask.
Yeah, like this. I mean that killing or
the most the heightened emotion. Okay.
Yeah, emotional.
Yes. Well, as the passage I read out earlier on in the graveyard, you know, it's very emotive. There's a lot going on there. So yes, you get carried away with the emotions there, with the you know, the horror at the end where there's the death in childbirth. You know, these are very emotive things. And I think if as a translator you can't feel the emotions of the heroes, then you're not going to be able to translate it quite rightly. So I think, yes, you know, obviously the murder scenes and the some of the political horrendous scenes as well, and the fear. Yes, I think you can identify with all of it. I think you have to as a translator, otherwise your translation might be flat.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Hello, I have a question.
Hi.
My name is Salih Shamshod. I'm a student, but combining translators activity also as well. And I have a question about math. How do you think? What's the importance, role of mathematics during translation?
Mathematics?
Yes, sure.
I don't really think much about mathematics when I'm translating.
In my experience, I met some guides, some girls which have a basis of mathematics, but didn't study philology, but they do translate better than those who doesn't mathematics basis.
Okay, and what's their idea?
How do you think?
How do you think it works?
Is it connected with this or not, or is it just a special occasion?
I'll have to think about that one. I'll have to think about it, because of course in terms of translating you're finding equivalence. So if you think of words as a number in an equation, then yes, you're kind of moving them around in that sense. A word could be seen as an equation, but I haven't thought about it in terms of mathematics before.
Yes, Mrs. Ermakova, but while translating into Uzbek from any Indo-European language, we should to replace the structure, replace the place of words. We should make some changes in the word amount also as well. And I think here is mathematical thinking abilities are very important to analyze and to unite the sentence elements. And I just wanted to know your opinion.
Okay, well, as I say, it's something I've not come across before. In terms of syllable structures, that would perhaps affect the length of the sentence, so that you could break it down and count them. Do you want to keep the same syllable structure? That would perhaps be important, certainly in poetry. If you're translating poetry where you've got a rhythm and a meter, you would need to try and keep the same thing. So from that point of view, yes. But to be honest, it's something I've not really come across, not thought about much.
Thank you.
But if you have any papers on it, you can send me and I'll read it, okay? Or we can discuss when I come to Bukhara.
I will email you. I will find you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, this is Shamshud Salih, one of our students, and he is one of very good students, very active students. And maybe next year, if you come, you maybe will be teaching them the theory of translation, Carol, as before.
Okay.
We have planned it. Yes.
I'll be too glad. We are colleagues. I'm translator also.
Great.
Yes.
Great. Translate into Uzbek.
5 languages we do translate.
Wow. Into Uzbek.
Into and from and into Russian also.
Okay. Okay. Good. Good.
Thank you. I'm glad to see you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to meeting you and discussing more when I come to Bukhara.
Sure.
One more question, may I? What difficulties have you found while translating Uzbek realis into English ones? It is a question from Mubashira. She has written in the chat. Yes, difficulties translating realis.
What does she actually mean by that?
Culture-bound words. Realias are usually culture-bound words such as dastarkan or chaykhana.
Yeah.
We have discussed. Maybe she missed this part.
Well, it's difficult, It's for me. I like to keep an element of the culture there, so I would always try to keep the original term, such as dastarkan, in the text, in the hopes that we're teaching our audience a little bit about Uzbek culture. I think that's important. And then obviously they need to know what it is. So some people translate it as tablecloth. Now that, for me, it just isn't right to call a dastarkan a tablecloth, because then you have to have a table and there often isn't a table. So it's not easy. So in that case, I would put a footnote. In other things, as I mentioned, in the architecture, you can just describe it. But generally, I would like to leave the actual cultural term there as much as possible. In the stories I mentioned earlier by Erkin Erzam, obviously a lot there. You know, there's the Chaikana, there's different things going on. Generally, I keep the original term if I can, with a translation, a one-word translation right next to it, and then a footnote. So that's how I would deal with the realia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay.
So, please, do we have any questions?
Sorry, excuse me.
Yes, Nafisa Farhadovna, I'm very happy to
can I
hear you.
Oh, so do you hear me?
Yes, yes, we quite well hear you.
I'm in a quite noisy place.
No, we can hear you quite well.
It's far from noise. So, Carol?
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm so happy and glad to hear you. I'm enjoying your presentation, and so I have some practical question as so is it okay to use, for example, in the English language or in some other languages, the words itself as realias? Like, as you mentioned, Dastarkhan or Khontakhta or something like this. Or the names of meals, for example, like Osh or Palo or Chuchvara. Because as I met in some books, in some textbooks published in America or by British press, there are some words as some Spanish words as paella or bungalow, the type of houses, and it is okay. So it is accepted in the English language.
Yes, yes, that's what I'm.
But still, they cannot. So sometimes they cannot be found in the in English dictionaries.
Well, personally, I think it's okay to leave it. I think it's a good idea to leave it. I hadn't mentioned food earlier on, but of course that's another thing that we meet a lot in different cultures. You're going to have different food. You have different types of soups, different kinds of drinks. And I think it's a good idea to leave the actual term. I'm curious. I like to know about other cultures. So I think it enriches the text if you leave the original term there and just put it there. You know, eventually people are going to pick it up. If Uzbek literature becomes, you know, very well known, in a few years' time, everybody will know what the Dastarkhan is, just as now everybody knows what a bungalow is or a chateau. So it's a slow process, but I think it's important to leave the actual terms in there. So from a practical point of view, that's what I would tend to do, but it does depend on your audience, and it does depend on ultimately on the publisher's decision. We can, of course, advise the publisher and make suggestions, but they're going to have their own editors and their own ideas. And eventually we have to agree with them.
And can we assume that the status of the language matters, the status of the language from which the words are derived matters? For example, so we cannot equalize the Uzbek language with the Spanish, for example.
Well, I don't know. Why is one language at a different stage from the other? Certainly in terms of spelling, the Uzbek language is in a different stage because it's in a state of flux still, and that makes it difficult. But, you know, a term like Dastarkhan or plov, they're so well established in Uzbek culture, they're definitely there. There's no question about them. So I think something like that you can easily put into your English translation. I think if you're an Uzbek translating into English, because I've seen a few texts translated by Uzbeks into English, I think the problems there are not so much the Uzbek cultural references, but the register of the English language, because it's certainly could Google Translate or even a dictionary, you will find many different translations for the same word, but you won't necessarily know the connotation behind it, the usage behind it, and the register. So some things might be better for, you know, a teenager to say, but you don't want your respected village elder to say it. And I think that's one reason why, if as an Uzbek you would like to translate into English, it's very, very, very important to work with a good English speaker, someone who is a linguist and a specialist in the field who can really help you and give you pointers in this direction. So I think you know, if you're an Uzbek translating into English, the problem you're not gonna be looking at Uzbek realia. It's more the target language that's going to cause you problems, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Carol.
Yeah.
Okay.
Carol.
Yes.
I want to ask you about the content. So the main problem while translating a literary work of one language into another language is connected with the content of the literary work. So while translating, have you kept this in mind? The content of, the content of the historical novel days gone by, because in the content of the novel we can become a witness of historical events. So how did you manage with these points? Did you keep them in mind? Did you keep them in mind while translating? Did you find any historical references where you can get more idea about these events or not? How did you overcome these difficulties?
Yes, that's a good point, because Kadiri is, as you say, the reader is a witness to all these historical events. And I did indeed read around, and I did indeed, you know, look a little bit to find out more about the Kipchaks and the siege of Tashkent and these things, to learn a little bit more of the background to the story. And so, yes, you need to be aware of the content, and I did keep it in mind. But as I said earlier, my job is to just translate, well, mainly translate what the author has written, and then the historians can evaluate it from a historical point of view. So although we're aware of the content and we're aware of the message that the author wants to put forward, ultimately how it's going to be analysed would depend on historians and literary critics. So, you know, we have to obviously deliver the content in the same style as the author did, and then it's up to other people to examine it.
Thank you. But the most important thing is the background knowledge of the translator about the culture of that people, of that nation, and to find out the most important things in the process of translation. That's why I asked you this question. Because,
Yes, definitely. I mean, you know, as I mentioned earlier on, in one of the skills that a translator needs to have, we need to have the ability to research things, because we're going to find a lot of things that are unfamiliar. An example, not from days gone by, but from the Uzbek documentary I mentioned earlier. I spent an awful long time researching that. I was fascinated by the, you know, all the different types of astronomy, how it moved around, you know, comparing it with other astronomers of the time, the history of what happens there. A lot of research went into that, and then it has to be condensed down. So I think a translator has a responsibility to do some historical research and background into the culture and the setting of the novel, definitely.
Thank you, Carol, for your interesting lecture, presentation, and for answering all our questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
This is Rano Kasimova. She works in our department. Together we work, and she is the teacher, the only teacher of the theory of translation for our students.
Okay.
And that's why she is really interested. She was really interested in your coming, because she had a lot of questions, and now she's asking turn by turn them. And maybe next time, next year, we will in cooperation, so work
together.
And yes, work together.
Great.
We will work together. I hope that you will be in Bukhara, you will visit our university, and we will be in touch with you.
Yes, I hope so very much.
Lecture classes, seminar classes. I hope that we will have together this class.
Yeah, yeah, I hope so too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Carol. Can I ask one more question?
Yes. Yes.
Sorry that this is connected with the translated book of Days Gone By. How can we get this book? Just I'm interested to, and I want to read this novel because I don't have this book yet, and I want to find and read this book.
Okay.
In English version.
As far as I know, it was available in, I don't remember the name of the bookshop, but it was available in Tashkent bookshops. And I think some copies were given to universities, I think.
In Tashkent bookshops.
Yes, on our chat, some participants, they wrote the address. In Chilanzar, you can buy in one of the shops. You can buy.
Yes, I bought it from the Chilanzar bookshop. It is near the metro of Chilanzar in Tashkent.
In Tashkent, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
All
you.
right.
Have you bought recently the book? Have you bought recently?
I bought in autumn. In autumn.
Sorry,
last year in autumn.
Last year in autumn.
Last year.
I bought it last year. Yes, in autumn. Yes.
If there's any problems,
I think is the book.
Okay, if we go to that shop, maybe shop assistant can help us to find the book itself. Thank you.
if you have a problem getting it, you can contact me and I'll contact the publisher and see if they can reprint it. I have no idea about that side of it, but I can ask them.
Thank you. Thank you once more. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay, Abror Trolovic.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol, for very interesting lecture. And I see that there were many questions, but probably we have to shift some of the questions to next time.
Yes.
Yeah, it was very good day in our university regarding the webinars, because in the morning we had like 2-3 hours webinar with other guests. She was from Netherlands, from Leiden University, and she finished University of California in Berkeley, and then did her master degree in Europe, and now she's doing PhD about Middle Ages, Central Asian literature and art also. And she's spending some months in Uzbekistan, including 3-4 days in Bukhara, in our university. And we witnessed a very good thing today. She is doing some research about Shahnama. Shahnama is written by Firdausi. It's a piece of poetic, how to say, book of Middle Ages. It belongs to 11th century, I guess. It's in Farsi. And when she saw Uzbek, not Uzbek, it's a Persian version written with very good calligraphy in our library, she was doing like this, the book, because she saw only the electronic copy of that book, some printed copies in Iran, but here when she visited our university, she saw that one of the original original versions. So she's staying 2-3 days more to work on that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and then we had the presentation of one new book. It's about Naqshbandi Tariqat and 7 peers. It's 7 saints of Bukhara. It's also written. It's the first book of this kind in Uzbekistan. Because it's the first very big book, not big, but big inside. With the content, and it's prepared by our alumni, our graduate student. And she finished our university some years ago. Of course, this is a personal copy.
Oh, lovely! Yeah.
Yeah, and he came also today here and presented his book because it's the first of this kind in Uzbekistan, and he wanted to present it in alma mater here.
yes.
Now and then we are having this your webinar, and we are speaking out the period of Uzbek novel, the days gone by. So thank you for all this presentation of our literature to the world by translating it into English, and also translating the documentary about Uzbek. And we look forward to meet with you in person.
Yes, yes, me too.
Please note that this is the first seminar, but it's not the last. So
okay.
Let's plan more.
Okay.
And also, we can't now, we don't have the possibility now, but we will be sending you a small certificate of appreciation later, okay?
Okay, thank you. Yes, that would be lovely.
And I see that in the webinar, there are many people participating from different universities also. And I would like to, on behalf of our university, I would like to thank you, say thank you for this beautiful webinar, and we look forward for the next webinars.
Okay, great. For me, it was, as I said earlier, it was my first Zoom experience, my first electronic webinar. So I was quite nervous, but you've all been very, very friendly. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. And dear colleague, this webinar is being recorded. And if Carol says okay, then we can send it to you also.
Okay. Okay, it should be fine.
Thanks.
Okay.
So I'm sorry I didn't just turn on the microphone. Abror Trubish, thank you so much for your very kind words and for your really just help and inspiration, because every time we address him, he always helps us in order to develop our relationship with foreign universities. We are very grateful to you. We appreciate your work as well. And Carol, of course, a great thanks to you, because you didn't say no, you agreed, and you answered so many questions asked by the students, researchers, doctors of philosophy, and there were a lot of teachers. And a special thanks to Nafisa Kasimova, because when started just signing agreement, just writing to you to invite you, Nafisa Kasimova always just supported me, saying, yes, Firuza, we should do. At that time, she was the head of our department, and now the head of our department changed, and she also wanted to participate, but she was just reading, she was participating in a master's dissertation. Without her, it was impossible to finish that defense. So anyway, we are all very grateful to you, Carol, and hope we are waiting another translations from you, translation of Uzbek works, or maybe in cooperation together with you when you will be in Bukhara, we can work on some translations, and you maybe will be editing, or maybe in future. So these are the plans. Together with students, we can translate maybe a collection of short stories by famous writers, and we can publish it. And because it will be the honor for our university, and of course I hope that in future will a great deal of work in cooperation together with you, Carol. Thank you so much.
Good. I hope so too. I hope so too. Okay. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Firuza, of course, for being the contact, and all the team here. Thank you ever so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Look forward to meeting you next time.